Okay, so welcome back, everybody. We are diving deep into a topic, um, something that I think is always relevant,
Okay.
But today we're talking all about leadership and authority. And we've got a really interesting set of sources. We'll be looking at how leaders are chosen, especially within religious traditions, so that should be pretty fun. And then we're also going to be looking at a glossary of terms that has to do with religious law and Islamic tradition.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really interesting deep dive. People usually, I think of leadership in like a secular context. But when you look at religious systems, you find these completely different frameworks.
Right. And it really makes you question things. I know I did when I was reading through the Sikhism material. I was reading about Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism,
Yeah.
and how he chose his successor, Guru Angad.
Right.
He didn't choose a family member. He didn't choose somebody super powerful. He chose him for like his humility and his dedication to helping people, to serving others. That really struck me.
Yeah, it's really important to think about the context for all of this. Sikhism, it emerged in a time and place where people were really looking for ethical leadership. They were experiencing so much in the way of power struggles, corruption, all these things. And so, these qualities of humility and service, they weren't just seen as nice. They were seen as the answer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like this idea of succession itself takes on this whole other meaning.
Right.
It becomes so much more than just filling a position. It's about making sure those important values continue.
It really does make you think about, well, what are the things that we value in a leader? How do we pass that authority on? And speaking of different systems, the glossary of terms that we have, it goes into religious law, particularly in Islam. It talks about how the Ummah, the global Muslim community, looks to the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran for guidance on how to live.
So hold on. I've always been a little unclear on this idea of religious law. Is it like a separate legal system? How does that work?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily about, setting up this whole other legal structure. It's more about like giving a set of guidelines, ethical and moral guidelines,
Right.
based on the teachings, the religious teachings, and individuals can use those to apply to their own lives. It's more like, how do I live a good life according to my faith?
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
The glossary also mentioned hadith.
Yeah.
And so are those also used when we're talking about interpreting these religious laws?
Exactly. The hadith are like collections of sayings and stories about the Prophet Muhammad's life, and they basically give context to the Quran's teachings. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, like footnotes in a really complex text.
Oh, right.
They're there to kind of help you understand the meaning better.
Yeah. Gotcha. So we've got, on the one hand, Sikhism. And it seems like humility and service are super important. And then you've got Islam, where religious law is guiding the community. And then, this is where it gets really interesting, the sources bring up bloodlines, like as a basis for authority. And they use the example of the British monarchy. That at first seems totally out of left field.
Yeah, but maybe not. I mean, obviously the British monarchy is a secular example, but the idea that, who your family is, your lineage, that gives you authority, that's actually been a really big part of religious leadership for a long time. For example, in Islam, some people believe that leaders should come from the Prophet Muhammad's family line.
That's a really interesting point. So you've got like two completely different ways of choosing a leader. One's based on your character, what you do, and the other one's based on, well, your family, your lineage. But isn't it risky, though, to just rely on bloodlines?
Sure.
I mean, what happens if the person who's supposed to be the leader, what if they're not the best person for the job?
Right. I mean, that is one of the main arguments against systems like that. You're putting all your faith in this idea that, being a good leader is something that's passed down through your genes, which, isn't necessarily true. But on the other hand, people who support this kind of system might say, well, it creates stability. It provides this connection to someone that everyone really respects.
So it seems like each approach comes with its own, like, pros and cons.
For sure.
If you focus on things like humility and service, like they do in Sikhism, well, you might end up with a leader who's really ethical, which is great.
Yeah.
But the process of choosing that leader, it gets a little more subjective, right?
Right, exactly. And even within systems that are based on religious law, like in Islam, there's still room for different opinions and interpretations. The Quran, like a lot of religious texts, it's not always super clear cut.
Yeah.
And the way people understand it can affect how religious law is actually used. It can even affect how they decide who's going to be in charge.
That is mind-blowing. Just the fact that the same text can be read in so many ways, and it can lead to such different ideas about leadership. It really shows you the power of interpretation.
It really does. And I think that's one of the big takeaways for anyone listening. It's not about finding the right way to do things. It's about understanding that there are all these different ways of thinking about leadership and authority.
So, like, what does this all mean for us?
Well,
I think it's a good reminder to really think about, what do we think makes a good leader? What are the things that we value? Do we care more about tradition, or do we care more about what actually works? And how do the choices that we make about all of this affect, our communities, our societies?
yeah. And, as we go forward, I think it'll be really interesting to see how these traditional ways of choosing leaders change. We've got all this technology now, globalization, the world's changing so fast. How are things going to adapt? How will that affect the way we see leadership, both in religious contexts and just in general?
I think those are some great questions, some things to really think about. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.